But at the end of the day, grizzly bears will be successful if they have what they need on the ground. And that doesn't have to be necessarily reliant on policies.
Thank you for tuning in to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Emmy Reed. What would Greater Yellowstone be like without the grizzly bear? Once upon a time, we were close to answering that question. Today, these grizzly bears represent one of the greatest conservation success stories. Going forward, we want to make sure that grizzlies can continue to thrive on the landscape long into the future. In Greater Yellowstone, figuring out the next steps in grizzly bear conservation and management is a complex issue. There isn't consensus on how best to manage grizzlies, and in this conversation, you'll have a better understanding of why it's so complicated. On this podcast episode, we'll dive into the history of grizzly bear conservation in Greater Yellowstone, chat about what's happening in the grizzly bear space today, and learn more about this entire process that honestly makes my head spin sometimes. Joining us on the podcast is the Greater Yellowstone Coalition's Wildlife Program Manager, Brooke Shifrin, who you may recognize from episode 2 on grizzly bears. Brooke's work focuses on grizzly bear policy and conservation strategies to ensure grizzlies are successful in the ecosystem while also keeping people safe and livelihoods intact. She's always been my go-to when trying to understand this intricate issue, and I'm so glad she'll be sharing her knowledge with us today. Before we get started, a quick note. We recorded this episode in December 2024 while awaiting a very important decision from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about whether grizzly bears should stay listed on the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. If you're listening to this episode after January 2025, we recommend checking out the show notes, which is where we'll post a link to the decision once it's been released. All right, let's jump into the conversation. Welcome back to the podcast, Brooke. We're so excited to have you join us again. Today, we're going to chat about grizzly bears again, but this time we're going to focus a little bit more on the history of the conservation of Greater Yellowstone grizzly bears and what's currently happening in this space. So let's start at a real high level. Why are grizzly bears so important to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Oh, I'd love to share on that. And thanks for having me back, Emmy. Um, yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons why grizzly bears are important to this region. From an ecological perspective, they're what is known as an umbrella species, which essentially means that when grizzly bears have what they need, so do a lot of other species. And so, one example of that is that grizzly bears need a lot of secure habitat, or in other words, places that aren't impacted by roads or human development. And so, if grizzly bears have enough secure habitat to thrive, a lot of other species are going to benefit from that as well. Um, from an economic perspective, grizzly bears are an icon in our region. They're an icon of wild nature, and I think they play a huge role in the attraction of millions of visitors to this region each year, and then the accompanying dollars that that visitation infuses into the communities in our region. And they're an inspiration for a lot of people. I mean, there's a reason why people travel from all around the world to come see grizzly bears, because they're this beautiful, magnificent, impressive creature. And as such, like, grizzly bears are ambassadors for conservation and inspire a lot of people to care about this place that we all love so much. And then, of course, grizzly bears have important cultural and spiritual significance for a lot of people too. Um, and I would even say, like, the fact that we live with grizzly bears is a point of pride for a lot of people that I work with in this region, especially people who are navigating a lot of conflict or challenges associated with living with grizzly bears. there's something to be proud of, when you think about living in such a wild place that we have to put in the extra effort that's required to successfully live alongside grizzly bears.
So, as I mentioned a bit earlier, we want to dive into the history of grizzly bear conservation in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Um, they're a species that has made one of the most remarkable comebacks when it comes to species recovery. And so, to tell this story, let's start at the very beginning. If the recovery of a species is needed, then that must mean something happened to create a decline. So, what happened to grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem all those years ago?
Yeah, well, to really understand that question, you have to go back quite a ways. And really, it started with a decline of grizzlies tied to European settlement of the American West, where grizzlies were pretty quickly reduced to a fraction of their historic range across North America. Between 1800 and 1975, grizzly bears in the lower 48 states were reduced from roughly around 50,000 bears to just around 1,000. And then by the late 1800s, grizzly bears were gone from much of the American West. And a lot of this decline was attributable to, lethal control of bears in response to livestock depredations, unregulated hunting of grizzly bears, commercial trapping of bears, development on the landscape, and the associated deterioration of habitat. Um, and so then fast forward to the formation of Yellowstone National Park in 1872. And not long after its formation, the park actually started offering what they called bear shows at garbage dumps. And so, you know, not surprisingly, a garbage dump attracted a large number of grizzly bears and also a large number of people who were hoping to see those grizzly bears. And that practice actually lasted for a while until World War II. And so even once those bear viewing shows sort of ended in the park continued to use these dump sites for garbage, and the dump sites continued to be a major attractant for bears. And as such, continued to be a place where visitors would gather to see grizzly bears up close. And what resulted was a lot of highly food conditioned bears who posed a pretty big risk to public safety. And so you may have heard about the Night of the Grizzlies in Glacier National Park, where two young women were killed in different locations in the park in the same night by grizzly bears searching for human foods up in that region. Um, and I think that tragic night was really quite a pivotal moment. In the story of grizzly bear conservation here in the lower 48, and sort of this reckoning like, wow, this is a really dangerous situation we've created. And so in 1970, Yellowstone National Park closed the last of their dumps, which ended about 80 years of feeding bears in the park. And when they did that, the what was left of the grizzly bear population here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem suffered a pretty major decline, because bears had for so long relied on park garbage dumps as a food source, and had become so accustomed to being in proximity to humans. There was like a big leap in human bear conflicts that ensued, and a lot of grizzly bear mortality as a result of that.
Wow. So grizzly bears really had to learn to rewild themselves
Pretty
after
much.
relying on people for so long.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And so, in those years following the closure of the dumps, there were a lot of bears venturing into campgrounds and other developed areas just looking for human food. And a lot of bears died as a result of that happening over those years. And so by the time grizzly bears were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, we didn't have a whole lot more than 100 grizzly bears left here in the heart of Greater Yellowstone.
Wow. So then that first step to close down food sources for grizzly bears, and then what were kind of the next steps to grizzly bear recovery?
Well, they really started with that decision to list grizzly bears as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. And that decision was applicable to grizzly bears across the lower 48 states. And that essentially catalyzed a number of important actions in terms of where we've gotten to today for grizzly bear recovery. An interagency committee of state and federal habitat and wildlife managers was established to increase coordination among states, the US government, and tribes around grizzly bear conservation. Ultimately, a research group called the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team was established with a focus on coordinating research and monitoring of grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That information that group has gleaned over time has been pretty critical to developing the strategies that have been so effective at helping grizzly bears make a comeback here in our region. Um, a recovery plan was established for grizzly bears that was ultimately finalized in 1993. And that plan identified 6 different recovery ecosystems, of which the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is one. And then a lot of different criteria were established within that plan around grizzly bear population health and habitat needs that informed a lot of the conservation actions that both managers at the state and federal level and private entities, conservation organizations, landowners, then coordinated around over a number of years that have led to what really has been a pretty impressive comeback of bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Wow. Yeah, it's such an amazing story, and kind of another conservation success story we often think about is the wolf reintroduction into Yellowstone. It's interesting that they ended up taking different routes to recovery. Brooke, why didn't we see a reintroduction of grizzly bears like we did with wolves?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, for one, we still had bears here in our region. Um, with the wolf reintroduction, we didn't have really any sort of functioning population of wolves remaining um, in the Northern Rockies, at least not down here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem or anywhere close to places besides those right next to the Canadian border. And so with bears, we still had some bears. There was still an opportunity to support the restoration and growth of that population. There's also just a lot that's unknown, actually, still at this point about the success of like long distance translocations of bears from one place to another and their ability to kind of reestablish um, and be successful in new places and totally new environment. And so I think it just made a whole lot of sense at that time to just identify strategies for trying to quickly reduce the amount of grizzly bear mortality that was occurring, and support, the habitat requirements that grizzly bears have to promote recovery of what we had left here.
So, grizzly bear management permeates many different agencies. You've got, pretty much everyone I feel like has a say in how, grizzly bears are managed. How do they all work together on this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're so right. I mean, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then looking beyond, thinking bigger picture about really the northern Rockies and where other grizzly populations exist and where grizzlies could exist in the future. It's such like the landscape is such a mosaic of land ownership. You've got private land, state land of all kinds, federal land of all kinds, tribal reservations. And so, and grizzly bears are a wide ranging species that require a lot of space on the landscape. And so, there's a true need for a strong interagency coordination and even intergovernmental coordination to support grizzly conservation over the long term, and that's not going away. That will always be the case. And so it's it's really a cool part of like the success story of conservation of grizzly bears here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and beyond, that there was enough foresight on that reality that what is known as the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee was formed. And that is essentially a collaborative environment for state and federal managers at all levels, along with tribal representatives, to coordinate on grizzly bear conservation and management. And so, in that space, and that committee is made up of executives at a high level, and then subcommittees that are focused on specific geographic regions, like the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, for example. And within those spaces, those agency representatives are sharing information. They're working together to develop conservation actions, and coordinating around those actions. One example of that would be like a food storage order, which is essentially a requirement on national forests that people who are visiting, recreating, camping, hiking, you name it, have to be really careful about storing things like food or other attractants that could be a food source for bears. Um, that that committee, that interagency committee, is also really the place um, where planning around what conservation strategies would look like for grizzly bears in a scenario where they were no longer protected under the Endangered Species Act.
Wow. Do you think grizzly bear recovery would have been different if there had just been one organization or one agency in charge of recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have been possible to get to where we are today without really strong collaboration among so many different governmental agencies and private partners. I mean, it really has required a significant investment by entities of all walks, really, in
Right.
our region to support the recovery of grizzly bears. It's really like it is something to be tremendously proud of. A multi-million dollar, multi generational investment by the American public in trying to bring this species that we value back from the brink of extinction, that's something to be celebrated for sure. And I'm confident that it couldn't have happened without the collaboration and coordination that has taken place over the last 40 some years.
Yeah, the agency list of members is so interesting. I went to their website, before this conversation, and I remember seeing like the United States Geological Survey on there, and I'm like, that's not who I would have guessed to be like a part of that team. But it's cool that there's just, all I think perspectives and work and studies being done that can all come together. And so it's really quite remarkable. And it's something that, like, yeah, our conservation sphere in this ecosystem can be really proud of, to
Mhm.
show how great collaborating can work for durable solutions.
Totally. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
So, Brooke, the facts are clear that grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have met recovery criteria established with their initial listing under the Endangered Species Act. But as we know, it's difficult to find consensus on how to ensure grizzly bears thrive long into the future. And as we know, a big topic of conversation is whether grizzly bears should be delisted from the Endangered Species Act and have their management turned over to the states. Could you tell us a little bit about why there are such differing opinions on this?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And that is kind of the world that I'm navigating every day in my job at GYC.
And you do it so well.
Oh, thanks, Emmy. I do what I can. Um, I, so it is correct that the recovery criteria identified in the recovery plan for grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been met, and they've been met for quite some time, really since the early 2000s. Now, I think that there are so many challenges in terms of getting to a place where the majority of people who are engaged on and care about grizzly bear conservation feel comfortable with the idea of delisting grizzly bears from the Endangered Species Act. And then at the same time, the people who are living with grizzly bear conflict on a day to day basis and really navigating some very real challenges that pose threats to their livelihoods, are frustrated that grizzly bears are still protected under the Endangered Species Act, because what that means is, potentially less flexibility in terms of what management can look like when addressing conflicts. So I think one challenge is that, you know, with anything, over time we learn and we grow on our understanding and our knowledge base. And with grizzly bears, that's very much the case. And we know a lot more now than we did in 1993 about what grizzly bears need to be successful and thrive on the landscape over the long term. And so there's a lot of people that really view the recovery plan as being um, somewhat outdated, and missing some important components to ensuring long-term long-term resilience and health of grizzly bears on the landscape. One of those things being the importance of connectivity between grizzly bear populations, so that grizzly bears are able to adapt to environmental shifts and changes over time. There's also just some legal realities in terms of the framework by which um, grizzly bears were listed under the Endangered Species Act, which was as a species across the lower 48 states, with this identification of these 6 places in the lower 48 where recovery could be viable. And sort of that framework or construct for listing grizzly bears, predating some important policy under the act that essentially defines what is a species and how you can delist distinct populations of species. And so, what I think is important to convey there is that these legal complexities just they really have muddied the waters in terms of like how the path, a legally robust path to delisting grizzly bears. There's also just some issues on principle that I think a large portion of the public have just like very divergent opinions and values around, hunting being one of them. Um, as long as grizzly bears are protected under the Endangered Species Act, the possibility of something like hunting of grizzly bears is a much more distant prospect. And um, under state management authority, hunting is likely to be part of the conversation in terms of the kind of suite of actions that are used to manage grizzly bears. And for some people, that is important, and for some people, that is abhorrent. And there's just like such a diverse range of opinions on that topic. And so, unfortunately, I feel like that topic has has really sort of muddied the waters in terms of these purely biological questions about what grizzly bears need to be successful and whether or not they need the protections of the ESA at this point in time. Um, and then just a very basic level, I mean, I think we encounter this every day in all the conservation work we do. Like, um, to break through impasses like the controversy around whether or not a species should be listed under the Endangered Species Act, like trust is required. And some people don't trust the federal government, some people don't trust the states. And so those are just very real challenges that complicate these questions that, again, are biological questions, but you cannot ignore these social realities that are layered on top of them.
Right, and it's such a good reminder that this is so much more complicated than it may seem at the surface level. That how many people are working on this and the differing opinions and the science and like man, I think if there's a takeaway, it's just that this is maybe not always as simple as it looks, really.
Yeah, I think that's an important takeaway. And I would add that it's not as straightforward as it might seem. But also, there's a lot of people who are involved with grizzly bear conservation and management, both within the states and the federal government, that are really smart problem solvers. And at the end of the day, we just it's like we need an opportunity for people to come together and like solve this next challenge, this next problem around, what is the path forward for long-term grizzly bear conservation that balances what they need on the landscape with the challenges of living alongside them.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Um, so a few years ago, the states of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho petitioned the federal government to delist grizzly bears and implement state-specific management plans. Can you tell us a bit about where we are in that process and just when we can expect some decisions?
Yeah, so a few years ago now, the three states of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho did petition the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to delist grizzly bears. Each of their requests was different in terms of kind of the scope of where grizzly bears would be delisted should the petitions be granted. Ultimately, what that did was initiate a process whereby the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to respond and make some decisions around the petitions. And where we are in that process is essentially awaiting a final decision from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on whether to delist the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem population down here in our region around Yellowstone National Park, and then whether or not to delist the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem population up kind of surrounding Glacier National Park. And so we're expecting a decision on those two petitions by January 20th. Certainly a decision on the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem population petition by then, but likely both of them by then. Um, Something else that came up in the midst of all of that process over the last couple of years was um, probably not surprising for many, a slew of lawsuits related to all of this. Um, and as a result of a couple different lawsuits, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also has to make an assessment of just how it will address the question of whether or not grizzly bears across the entire lower 48 states should be listed under the Endangered Species Act. And so there's a number of different ways they could choose to go about addressing that requirement, which is essentially the requirement of a court settlement agreement. So all that is to say that in the very near future, we should expect decisions from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on delisting those two populations that I mentioned, along with um, a bigger picture proposal around just how grizzly bears um, are listed essentially under the Endangered Species Act or not, per the requirement of that settlement agreement I alluded to. So it's a pretty pivotal moment in the story arc of, grizzly bears and the Endangered Species Act. Should grizzly bears be delisted in some way, shape, or form? Then in that scenario, management authority would shift over to the states and tribes, and state specific management plans and tribal management plans would then be sort of the guide for grizzly bear conservation and management moving forward, along with some previously established interagency agreements and strategies. Montana's management plan was just completed recently. So that plan's done and finalized. Wyoming's plan was completed back in, I think it was around 2016 or so, if I'm remembering right. And Idaho's plan was completed back in 2002. So pretty dated at this point, I would say.
Yeah, that's a lot going on. I mean, it's just again, like we were talking about before, this is such a complicated issue with a lot of moving parts, but
Yeah.
there's also a lot of ways that we can ensure grizzly bears persist long into the future that don't even, really relate to how they're managed, but more of some things that we can do on the ground. And so, of course, you work for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and we're doing a lot to help prevent bear conflicts. Can you tell us a bit about what you and the team are working on?
Yeah, you bet. And I think you touched on something so important there, Emmy, which is undoubtedly the like these policies, and when I say policies, I mean like their status under the Endangered Species Act and state management plans and all these other moving parts that I will not bore you all with. um, those are important in terms of guiding grizzly bear conservation and management. But at the end of the day, grizzly bears will be successful if they have what they need on the ground. And that doesn't have to be necessarily reliant on policies. The policies are an important piece of the picture there. But there's a lot of good work that can happen kind of regardless of all of those other moving parts that are so influenced by politics and things that are so often outside of ours and others' control. And so we really try to focus on those on ground things that are good for bears and good for people who live alongside bears and are dealing with the day to day conflicts that come with that reality. And so that's where GYC's emphasis on conflict prevention and really trying to address not only sources of conflict between bears and people, whether that's bears getting into trash or campgrounds or bears preying on people's livestock. There are a whole suite of different kinds of tools that can be deployed to try and reduce those conflicts and also prevent the risk of them occurring in the first place. And so GYC partners with ranchers, landowners, communities, other agencies, the Forest Service, all with an eye toward trying to prevent those conflicts because it keeps bears alive and it's also good for people. It keeps people safe and it protects people's livelihoods. And so there's a lot of common ground there that we can work with. Um, all of that work around conflict prevention supports our goals around seeing linkage between grizzly bear populations in the lower 48 states and trying to find ways to support that connectivity that is so important for grizzly bears to be resilient long into the future. And then we also do a lot of important on ground work to protect core habitat. And that looks many different ways, but really what it's about is, really protecting what we have in terms of grizzly bear habitat that is not negatively impacted by human development. Going back to kind of, I think, how we started this podcast, which is like grizzly bears are an umbrella species. If they have what they need, a lot of other species benefit. And number one there is secure habitat. And so there's a lot of things we can do on the ground to improve grizzly bear habitat.
What makes you excited or hopeful about the work that you and you're doing or just like the work that you're seeing on the ground? Yeah, what gets you excited?
I so appreciate that question. Yeah, especially because when we're on sort of the cusp of big decisions around things like grizzly bears and the Endangered Species Act, and there's a lot of uncertainty around, that policy component long into the future. It just feels like it's so important to remember why there are so many reasons for optimism when we think about grizzly bear conservation long into the future when we're faced with a lot of uncertainty. And so, for me, I think it's important to think about like the time scale and really think about how far we've come. Grizzly bears were on the brink of extinction 40 years ago, and now we have grizzly bears showing up in places they haven't been for generations. And that is undoubtedly posing new challenges for people who are living alongside bears. But it also highlights how successful this conservation effort has been over the last several decades. And so when I go to my places of worry and fear, I try to remember that if you take a step back, we've come a long way. And so that has me excited and hopeful. Um, that work around conflict prevention keeps me excited and hopeful all the time because it's work that there is so much common ground around with groups of people who have such a diversity of perspectives on grizzly bears and other wildlife. But the need to address conflict between wildlife and people is such an easy starting point for um, shared understanding and common ground. And so there's a lot of opportunity within that. Um, and through that work, I've learned that, even among people who see the world very differently than I see it, when it comes to species like grizzly bears and wolves that are highly controversial, people really do view grizzly bears as a point of pride. And the fact that we have grizzly bears here in our region is something to be proud of. And I think a lot of people who live and work here are proud of that. I mean, it's pretty badass, really, to live alongside bears. That's cool. And when I see people sort of reflecting that, I feel excited and hopeful for the future. Um, and then I think the last thing I'll say there is just, I feel like I so often, in the context of my work, get to interact with people who are really committed to solving problems and finding solutions in the face of really complex challenges. Um, and often those are people coming at an issue with so many different interests and perspectives. And yet there's a general commitment to solving problems and finding solutions. And I think GYC has found in its work, not just on grizzly bears, but on so many other issues, that sentiment in our region helps us be really successful in securing tangible, important conservation outcomes.
That's awesome, Brooke. That makes me hopeful too
I'm
and
so
excited
glad.
for grizzly bears. And yeah, you're right. When all of these things that feel out of our control are happening, it's a good reminder that, hey, there are a lot of things that are more in our control and we can make really positive impacts on. I love our grizzly bear conflict prevention work. It's, just the best way that we can really help these bears and have them continue to be the amazing conservation recovery success story that they are.
Absolutely.
Brooke, we got one final question for you. You've been on the podcast before. For those who maybe haven't listened, Brooke was on our second episode of the podcast to talk about bears. So we've already asked her who her conservation hero is. So I wanted to mix it up. And I would love to hear if you have a conservation focused book, podcast, documentary, any sort of, media that you would recommend to our listeners today.
That is a good question. And there's so many things coming to mind. But I recently read a book called The Seed Keeper, and it's a novel, but it is very much based on, um, you know, true historical events. The main character in the novel is named Rosalie Ironwing. She's a Dakota woman, and it's set in the Minnesota River Valley of southern Minnesota. And really, it's a pretty powerful reflection on um, the this farming community in the Midwest, navigating a pretty dramatic transition from like small family farming to industrial corporate farming, where there's things like genetically engineered seeds and machines and chemicals and like all these new realities being navigated, with sort of this layering of the history of the US Dakota War and what it's like to be an Indigenous woman living in that context. And there's just some really powerful, beautiful insight around this main character's perspective on caring for the land and what that actually really means and looks like, and how that's inextricably tied with caring for your community and your people. Um, and and her trying to do that as she's navigating pretty significant intergenerational trauma as a result of the history of her region and being an Indigenous woman in that place. And, it's a context that is different from ours here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but there's so many parallels that I drew from reading that book. And time and again, I just find that these stories that sort of weave together Indigenous knowledge with more kind of Western views of conservation are really powerful and helpful for me in thinking about how to be more effective in my work. And I also learned so much about really important history that we should all be aware of when doing that.
Love it. That's a great recommendation. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes for our listeners to check out. And Brooke, as always, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I'm sure we're going to have you back again someday to talk more about bears. We could talk about bears forever.
I'm always
Uh,
happy to sit down and talk about bears.
Another big thank you to Brooke for stopping by the podcast and sharing her expertise on the remarkable story of Greater Yellowstone grizzly bear conservation. As I mentioned in the intro to the episode, please check out the show notes to see if an ESA decision has been posted to learn more about the next steps in grizzly management. Whatever decision comes, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition is committed to helping grizzly bears thrive long into the future by ensuring any future management framework protects core habitat, prevents human bear conflicts, maintains stable bear populations, and supports grizzly bear presence in areas that link populations. We've been working on grizzly bear conservation for 40 years, and our work will continue. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If you join GYC's online community via the link in the show notes, we'll mail you a free Voices of Greater Yellowstone sticker and a Greater Yellowstone Coalition sticker. This opportunity will run from November 1st, 2024 to February 28th, 2025, so make sure to sign up between those dates to get your stickers in the mail. Thank you for supporting the podcast, and we'll see you next time.